When you imagine the history of divorce in the United States, your mind might immediately drift toward modern courtrooms, high-profile celebrity separations, or the common statistics repeated in news reports. Yet, to truly understand why divorce became so common in America, you must begin far earlier, back in the 1600s, when the English colonies in North America were still fragile, scattered, and deeply shaped by religious tradition. In Puritan New England, marriage was not primarily thought of as a romantic bond. Instead, it was viewed as a covenant, a solemn contract before God and the community. A man and a woman entered into marriage not just for companionship or affection, but to create a stable household, a unit that could contribute to the survival and moral health of the colony. Within this framework, divorce was almost unthinkable, but it was not entirely absent. In England at the time, divorce was exceedingly rare. The Church of England allowed annulments under strict conditions, usually when a marriage could be proven invalid from the start, such as in cases of impotence, consanguinity, or fraud. Full legal divorce, as we would understand it today, was largely inaccessible to ordinary people. Only Parliament could grant a divorce, and such cases were reserved for the wealthy elite. But in New England, something quietly different unfolded. The Puritan colonies developed their own courts, their own systems of law, and their own interpretations of Scripture. To the Puritans, the Bible was clear: marriage was a civil matter, not just a religious one. That meant colonial courts had authority over marriage and divorce. The result was that in Massachusetts and Connecticut, as early as the mid-1600s, divorces were granted under certain conditions. These early divorces were few in number, but they set a precedent. The grounds were specific: adultery, desertion, bigamy, or extreme cruelty. The court records of Massachusetts reveal examples: a husband who disappeared for years and was presumed dead, a wife who was beaten severely, a spouse who engaged in unrepentant adultery. In such cases, the Puritan judges, stern and deeply moral men, might reluctantly allow the dissolution of marriage. What is striking about this early history is not the volume of divorces, for they were rare, but the principle. The idea that a marriage could be legally ended, under civil law, was firmly planted in American soil from the very beginning. Unlike in Catholic Europe, where marriage was indissoluble in practice, or in England, where the privilege was restricted to elites, the New England colonies allowed divorce to be a possibility for ordinary settlers. It is worth picturing the slow, deliberate process of such cases. Imagine a small wooden meetinghouse serving as a courthouse. A judge sits with a Bible open before him, and the community gathers to listen. A wife accuses her husband of abandonment, stating that he left her to fend for herself and their children in a harsh wilderness. Witnesses speak, documents are examined, and at last, the judge declares that the covenant of marriage has been broken beyond repair. Such scenes were not common, but they existed, and they represented something profoundly different about the American experience. Outside of New England, the story was more complicated. In colonies like Virginia and Maryland, where Anglican influence was stronger, divorce was nearly impossible. Southern colonies leaned more heavily on English traditions, and marriage remained tightly bound to property, inheritance, and social status. In those regions, unhappy spouses often turned to informal separations, private agreements, or simply desertion. The legal recognition of divorce remained far weaker than in the Puritan-dominated North. As the colonies grew, the regional differences in divorce law became one of the many threads of diversity that shaped early America. By the time of independence in 1776, the idea that states had authority to regulate marriage and divorce was well established. Each state would go on to craft its own laws, with some taking a stricter approach and others allowing broader grounds. In the early Republic, after the Revolutionary War, Americans began to experiment with a broader application of divorce. The Enlightenment ideals of personal liberty, individual rights, and contract theory influenced lawmakers. If marriage was a contract, then surely contracts could be dissolved. In states like Connecticut, Vermont, and Pennsylvania, divorce petitions began to rise, though still in small numbers. Grounds expanded beyond adultery and desertion to include drunkenness, neglect, or even incompatibility in some rare cases. The process, however, was not uniform. In South Carolina, for instance, divorce was entirely prohibited until after the Civil War. In New York, the law was so strict that adultery remained the only acceptable ground for divorce until the mid-1800s. Meanwhile, in frontier states and territories, where institutions were looser and communities more transient, divorce was often easier to obtain. The frontier spirit of independence and practicality seemed to shape even family law. Yet, it is important to note that in these early decades, divorce was still viewed with suspicion. Newspapers of the late 1700s and early 1800s sometimes published divorce cases, treating them as scandalous curiosities. Religious leaders warned that the loosening of marriage laws would undermine the moral foundation of society. Politicians debated whether easy divorce encouraged irresponsibility. But in spite of the criticism, the numbers grew. By the mid-1800s, divorce had become a recognizable part of American society. The U.S. Census even began tracking divorce rates in 1867, the first country in the world to do so systematically. Already, observers in Europe looked with a mix of fascination and disapproval at the American tendency to dissolve marriages more freely than in their own countries. The roots of this divergence, however, stretch back to those Puritan meetinghouses, where marriage was first treated as a civil matter, and where the possibility of ending a union was written into the earliest colonial codes. What began as a rare exception in a stern religious community had grown into a legal tradition that distinguished America from the Old World. But this raises a deeper question: was divorce in early America truly about personal freedom, or was it more about community control? After all, the same Puritan courts that granted divorces also heavily regulated personal behavior, punishing drunkenness, idleness, and sexual misconduct. Was early divorce a matter of individual rights, or a mechanism for maintaining moral order in small, fragile communities? And perhaps more intriguingly, how did this tension between freedom and control shape the way Americans thought about marriage for centuries to come? When you think of the 19th century in America, images often come to mind of wagons rolling westward, steam engines hissing in railway stations, factories filling with workers, and small towns slowly transforming into bustling cities. Beneath all of this visible change, however, there were equally significant changes unfolding in the private lives of families, and in the fragile institution of marriage. Divorce, though still far from common, began to find a firmer place in the lives of ordinary Americans. The early 1800s were a time of rapid geographic movement. Families packed their belongings, hitched oxen to wagons, and traveled west into lands that seemed endless and full of promise. The western frontier was a place of opportunity, but also instability. Communities were young, churches and courts were thinly established, and families were often separated by great distances. In such conditions, marriages could be both strengthened by the demands of survival and strained by the challenges of isolation. When a husband left for months, or even years, to pursue mining, trading, or exploration, wives were left to manage households alone. Some returned, others did not. Abandonment became a recurring issue in frontier life, and courts were faced with growing petitions for divorce on the grounds of desertion. What had once been a relatively rare cause in settled colonial towns became common in the itinerant life of the frontier. The law, too, was changing. As new states entered the Union, each had to establish its own legal code. Many state constitutions included explicit provisions for regulating divorce, reflecting the fact that marriage was seen as a civil contract, subject to the authority of civil government. By the mid-19th century, divorce laws varied widely across states. Some permitted only the narrowest grounds, such as adultery, while others allowed for desertion, cruelty, habitual drunkenness, or even vague claims of incompatibility. This patchwork system had an interesting consequence: people began to seek out states with more liberal divorce laws, traveling hundreds of miles to file petitions. The phenomenon of migratory divorce, later most famously associated with Nevada, was already taking root in the 1800s. For instance, Indiana became notorious in the mid-19th century for its permissive statutes, attracting individuals from other states who wished to end their marriages. Newspapers dubbed Indiana the divorce mill, reflecting both fascination and moral outrage. At the same time, the Industrial Revolution was reshaping family life in profound ways. In agrarian societies, marriage was often an economic partnership. Husbands and wives worked side by side on farms, raising children who contributed to the household labor. In industrial towns and cities, however, men increasingly went to factories, offices, or shops, while women were left to maintain the home. This separation of spheres, men in the public world of work, women in the private world of domestic life, created new pressures on marriages. Economic independence was uneven. Most women had little means to support themselves outside of marriage, which limited their ability to pursue divorce. Yet, for some, particularly widows or women with modest inheritances, the urban economy offered new possibilities. Boarding houses, textile mills, and domestic service provided limited but real opportunities for women to earn wages. These developments gradually loosened the absolute dependence of women on husbands, opening the door, however slightly, to the idea that leaving an unhappy marriage might be possible. Religious and cultural attitudes toward divorce, however, remained deeply divided. In New England, where Protestant Reformed traditions were strong, some argued that divorce was a necessary safeguard against vice and abuse. In the South, where family honor and property inheritance were tightly linked to marriage, divorce remained far more stigmatized. Catholic immigrants, arriving in large numbers from Ireland and later from Southern Europe, brought with them traditions that viewed marriage as indissoluble. Meanwhile, Protestant revivalists of the Second Great Awakening warned that America's growing acceptance of divorce reflected moral decline. Despite the resistance, the numbers told a different story. Census records reveal that between 1867, when systematic tracking began, and 1886, the divorce rate doubled. By the end of the century, the United States had the highest divorce rate in the world, a fact noted with shock by foreign commentators. To Europeans, the idea that ordinary people could dissolve marriages with relative ease seemed symptomatic of America's restless, individualistic spirit. One important factor in this rise was the changing role of alcohol in American life. The 19th century was marked by widespread concern about drunkenness, particularly among men. Drunkenness was not only a moral failing in the eyes of temperance reformers, but also a direct threat to family stability. Courts in many states began to recognize habitual drunkenness as grounds for divorce, reflecting the intersection of social reform movements and family law. The temperance movement, which would eventually culminate in prohibition, found one of its early victories in reshaping the conditions under which women could legally leave their husbands. Another factor was violence. Domestic abuse, though often hidden or dismissed in earlier centuries, became a recognized cause for divorce in many states during the 19th century. The concept of cruelty broadened over time, moving from purely physical harm to include emotional and psychological abuse. This shift reflected both a changing legal culture and a growing recognition of the vulnerabilities within family life. The Civil War also had its effect. War disrupted marriages across the nation, separating couples for years and creating conditions of strain, loss, and hardship. Some soldiers never returned, others came back changed, bearing the scars of trauma. The war also accelerated economic and social shifts, particularly in the lives of women who had managed farms, businesses, and households in the absence of men. When the war ended, some women were less willing to return to marriages that had been deeply unfulfilling or oppressive. By the late 19th century, the debate over divorce had entered the national political stage. Reformers worried that the rising rates threatened the stability of society, while others argued that liberal divorce laws were a mark of progress, protecting individuals, especially women, from harmful unions. In 1881, the National Divorce Reform League was founded, dedicated to creating more uniform laws across the states. Their efforts revealed just how inconsistent and fragmented the system had become, with some states granting divorces on broad grounds and others refusing them altogether. The very existence of the League highlights how visible divorce had become. No longer a hidden or private matter, it was now a subject of public policy, journalism, and moral debate. Cartoons of the period satirized divorce mills, and the supposed fickleness of Americans who would dissolve marriages as easily as they formed them. Ministers preached sermons on the dangers of weak family ties. Yet behind all the rhetoric were thousands of ordinary men and women, navigating difficult choices in their personal lives. It is easy, when looking back, to imagine that the growth of divorce was inevitable in a society marked by mobility, industrial change, and individualism. But at the time, it felt deeply uncertain. Would marriage survive in its traditional form, or would it be reshaped into something entirely different? Was America pioneering a new vision of personal freedom, or was it undermining the most essential institution of civilization? And perhaps most curiously, as the 19th century closed and the 20th century approached, was divorce becoming less of a scandal, and more of a routine fact of American life? By the late 19th century, divorce had become a subject that could no longer be quietly handled in local courts or whispered about in small communities. It had become a matter of national debate, fueling heated discussions in newspapers, pulpits, and legislatures. The numbers, though still small compared to the vast population, were rising steadily. Each new decade brought a visible increase in divorce petitions, and with them came public anxiety. Was marriage itself under threat in America? Or was divorce simply a necessary adaptation to the pressures of modern life? The first thing to understand about this period is how uneven the system was. Every state controlled its own divorce laws, and those laws varied dramatically. In some states, like New York, divorce was extremely limited, permitted only on the grounds of adultery until as late as 1966. In others, like Indiana, the statutes were broad and flexible, allowing couples to dissolve their unions for reasons such as cruelty, drunkenness, or neglect. This unevenness created what reformers and critics alike referred to as a patchwork of divorce laws. This patchwork system gave rise to what might be called divorce tourism. If you lived in a state with strict laws but desperately wished to escape a marriage, you could travel to a state with more liberal rules, establish a brief residency, and file there. The most notorious example in the 19th century was Indiana. Its law required only a year of residency, and the grounds for divorce were numerous. For a time, the state became famous, some would say infamous, for attracting those seeking freedom from unhappy marriages. The press had a field day with such cases. Newspapers published sensational stories of wealthy couples traveling across state lines to dissolve their unions. Critics accused Indiana of cheapening marriage, turning it into a contract that could be broken with ease. Clergymen thundered from pulpits about the erosion of family values. And yet, for every scandalous headline, there were countless quiet cases of ordinary people, farm wives abandoned by husbands, laborers trapped in violent marriages, women seeking relief from drunken spouses, who found in Indiana's courts a measure of justice otherwise denied to them. Still, the unevenness posed a problem. Could a divorce granted in one state be recognized in another? What if a man divorced his wife in Indiana, then remarried in Massachusetts, where his first divorce might not be recognized? Such legal ambiguities created a tangle of complications that stretched all the way to the Supreme Court. Cases involving the recognition of out-of-state divorces became recurring issues in American jurisprudence, highlighting the tension between state authority and national consistency. The moral controversy deepened with each passing year. In 1889, the U.S. government published a comprehensive report on divorce, the first of its kind, covering the years 1867 to 1886. The findings startled many. During that period, the divorce rate had doubled. The report revealed that America was leading the world in dissolving marriages. To defenders of traditional values, this was a crisis. To reformers, it was a sign of progress. Either way, it was undeniable evidence that divorce was no longer a marginal phenomenon. One of the loudest critics was Theodore Woolsey, a Yale president and a leading member of the National Divorce Reform League. He and others pushed for uniform national laws, fearing that the lack of consistency would corrode the very foundation of marriage. But uniformity was hard to achieve in a federal system where states fiercely guarded their right to regulate family law. Interestingly, even as critics decried divorce, many reformers saw it as a solution rather than a problem. Feminist activists of the 19th century, such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, argued passionately for liberal divorce laws. For them, the institution of marriage, as legally structured, was often oppressive to women. Divorce, though stigmatized, offered women a path to independence and escape from abuse or neglect. Stanton, in her speeches and writings, directly challenged the idea that marriage should be indissoluble, insisting instead that it should be based on mutual respect and equality. Yet Stanton's position was controversial even among fellow reformers. Some women's rights advocates feared that promoting divorce would alienate potential allies, especially in religious communities. Others saw the fight for suffrage as a more urgent priority, relegating divorce reform to the margins. Still, the very fact that divorce was part of the broader conversation on women's rights illustrates how deeply it had entered the national consciousness. Beyond the ideological debates, the practical realities of divorce were often far from glamorous. Court cases could be lengthy, humiliating, and invasive. Spouses were forced to air their private grievances before judges and communities. Accusations of adultery, cruelty, or drunkenness became public record, and newspapers often picked up sensational details. For many, the process was a source of shame, even when legally successful. And yet, despite the stigma, people persisted. By the end of the 19th century, divorce was steadily carving out its place in American life. Rates continued to rise, and the courts became increasingly accustomed to handling petitions. What had once been an extraordinary remedy had become, if not commonplace, at least familiar. It is worth pausing to reflect on the contrast between perception and reality. To critics, the rising divorce rate symbolized a collapse of family values. To supporters, it represented progress and personal freedom. But for most of the people actually involved in divorce proceedings, it was neither a symbol nor a grand statement. It was a deeply personal, often painful decision, made in the face of hardship. A farm wife beaten by her husband, a laborer abandoned by his spouse, a woman married to a drunkard who squandered the family's wages, these were the human stories behind the statistics. As the century drew to a close, divorce was no longer an issue that could be ignored. It had become a defining feature of American social life, distinguishing the United States from much of Europe. In France, England, and Germany, divorce remained tightly restricted. In Catholic countries like Italy or Spain, it was virtually impossible. America, with its restless mobility, democratic ideals, and patchwork legal system, had forged a new path, one in which divorce was not only possible but increasingly accessible. Still, many questions lingered. Would the growing acceptance of divorce weaken marriage as an institution, or would it ultimately strengthen it by ensuring that only willing and committed partners remain together? Would the patchwork of state laws ever be harmonized into a coherent national standard, or would the inconsistencies continue to breed controversy? And perhaps most significantly, as America prepared to enter the 20th century, was divorce destined to remain a source of scandal and debate, or was it on its way to becoming an ordinary part of modern life? By the closing years of the 19th century, divorce in the United States was no longer a quiet matter confined to local courts. It had become a national conversation, a social question debated in newspapers, pulpits, women's clubs, and legislative halls. What had once been a rare remedy, granted reluctantly in colonial meetinghouses, was now a regular feature of modern American life. Divorce was still stigmatized, but it was increasingly visible, and with visibility came controversy. The 1890s marked an era of transition. America was moving rapidly into modernity, cities swelled with immigrants, factories hummed with machinery, and the frontier, once a defining feature of national identity, was declared closed by the Census Bureau. Social reform movements flourished, from temperance to labor rights to women's suffrage. In this atmosphere of reform and anxiety about rapid change, marriage and divorce became subjects of public scrutiny. Statistics told part of the story. The federal government, after conducting its first national divorce study in the 1880s, continued to track the trend. Between 1867 and 1906, the divorce rate had more than doubled. By 1900, the United States had a divorce rate 10 times higher than that of France or Great Britain. This fact was widely reported in the press, often with alarmist overtones. Foreign observers were quick to point out what they saw as America's moral laxity, and American commentators echoed these concerns, wondering if the nation's character was at risk. Yet the rising divorce rate was not evenly distributed across the population. It was shaped by geography, class, and gender. Urban centers, with their anonymity and mobility, saw higher rates than rural areas. Middle-class women, who had more access to education and sometimes to independent income, were more likely to seek divorce than poorer women, who remained economically dependent on husbands. And regional differences persisted. New England and the Midwest were more permissive, while the South clung to stricter norms, with South Carolina still prohibiting divorce entirely. The debates of this era often took on a moral tone. Clergy lamented the erosion of family stability, framing divorce as evidence of a broader decline in social discipline. Ministers in Protestant churches, especially, worried that the sanctity of marriage was being undermined by a culture of individualism. Catholic leaders, bound by the doctrine of indissolubility, condemned divorce outright, arguing that civil law had no right to dissolve what God had joined. At the same time, reformers within some Protestant traditions argued that divorce could be a moral necessity, a way to free individuals from cruelty or neglect. Women's rights activists, too, took up the issue. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, whose advocacy had stretched back to the mid-19th century, continued to argue into the 1890s that liberal divorce laws were essential for women's freedom. By then, she was often criticized, even by fellow suffragists, for being too radical. Still, her insistence that marriage should be based on mutual respect, and that women should have the right to leave oppressive unions, left a lasting impression on the debate. Other women's organizations, such as the General Federation of Women's Clubs, often took more cautious stances, focusing on the protection of children and the need for marriage reform, rather than explicitly endorsing divorce. Meanwhile, the press fueled public fascination with divorce. Newspapers reported sensational cases involving wealthy families, politicians, or celebrities. The details of courtroom battles, accusations of infidelity, cruelty, or desertion, were laid out in lurid detail, feeding a readership eager for scandal. Divorce, once a private matter, had become a kind of public spectacle. Satirical cartoons depicted divorce mills grinding out separations with mechanical efficiency. Editorials debated whether easy divorce was a symptom of social progress or moral decay. This period also saw the rise of what would later be called divorce colonies. Certain places became famous for their permissive laws and short residency requirements. Before Reno, Nevada, took the crown in the 20th century, other towns briefly played this role. Sioux Falls, South Dakota, for example, gained notoriety in the 1890s for attracting wealthy Easterners who established temporary residence there to secure divorces. Hotels and boarding houses catered specifically to this clientele, creating a small industry around marital dissolution. The existence of such colonies highlighted a growing reality: divorce was not simply a private issue but also an economic one. Local economies benefited from the influx of temporary residents seeking freedom from unhappy marriages. Lawyers, hoteliers, and merchants all profited from the trade. This dynamic made divorce a curious intersection of personal suffering and public enterprise. The Progressive Era, spanning the early decades of the 20th century, only intensified the debate. Reformers, concerned with everything from child labor to public health, viewed divorce as part of the larger question of social stability. Some argued for stricter laws to protect families, while others pressed for uniform national standards to eliminate the confusion of interstate differences. In 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt weighed in, condemning the rising divorce rate as a national problem and urging Congress to consider reforms. His statements reflected the belief that the health of the family was directly tied to the health of the nation. Roosevelt's comments sparked the creation of a joint committee on uniform divorce laws, which sought to standardize rules across states. Yet, like earlier efforts, the attempt faltered. States were unwilling to surrender their authority, and regional differences remained too stark to bridge. The failure of uniform reform revealed a central tension of American life: the balance between local control and national coherence. Even as debates raged, the lived experiences of ordinary people often diverged from the rhetoric. For many women, divorce remained difficult and risky. Social stigma was strong, and economic survival outside marriage was precarious. Some judges were sympathetic, granting divorces in cases of cruelty or desertion. Others were hostile, lecturing petitioners about their duties and denying relief. Outcomes varied not just by state, but by county and even by individual courtroom. The period also saw the beginnings of a shift in cultural attitudes toward love and marriage. The 19th century ideal of marriage as primarily an economic and social contract was giving way to the 20th century notion of marriage as a relationship rooted in romantic love. This shift created new expectations, and new disappointments. If marriage was supposed to bring personal happiness, then its failure felt more intolerable. Divorce, in this context, was not merely an escape from abuse or neglect, but sometimes a search for fulfillment that marriage had not delivered. By the 1920s, divorce had entered the mainstream of urban life. Jazz-age culture, with its emphasis on liberation, modernity, and personal freedom, cast divorce in a slightly different light. For some, it symbolized a break with tradition, a willingness to embrace modern values. For others, it remained a troubling sign of cultural decline. Popular magazines ran articles with titles like, "Is Marriage a Failure?" and "The Divorce Evil," reflecting both fascination and fear. At the same time, psychologists and social scientists began studying marriage and divorce in systematic ways. The new fields of sociology and psychology offered explanations that moved beyond moral judgment. Divorce, they suggested, could be understood as a social phenomenon shaped by economic, cultural, and psychological forces. This more scientific approach marked a subtle shift in the way Americans thought about family life, not just in terms of morality and sin, but also in terms of adaptation, stress, and change. By the early 1930s, with the Great Depression unfolding, divorce rates slowed briefly, not because marriages were necessarily happier, but because the economic hardships of the time made separation less feasible. Lawyers' fees, court costs, and the prospect of supporting two separate households were simply beyond the reach of many families struggling to survive. Separation, rather than divorce, became more common during those lean years. Yet even then, the cultural acceptance of divorce as an option lingered, waiting to rise again once economic conditions improved. Looking back at this period, it becomes clear that divorce had moved from the margins to the center of American social debate. No longer an occasional remedy, it was now a symbol, a litmus test for values, a point of contention that touched on religion, politics, economics, and gender. For some, it embodied the freedom and individuality that defined the American spirit. For others, it represented a dangerous erosion of discipline and duty. But as the nation moved deeper into the 20th century, one question remained unresolved: would divorce remain a controversial exception, always debated and criticized, or was it slowly becoming a normalized part of the American life cycle, as routine as marriage itself? By the early 20th century, the United States was facing a peculiar problem. No two states agreed on exactly how divorce should work. Some required years of residence before even considering a petition. Others demanded strict evidence of adultery, cruelty, or abandonment, and some offered broader definitions of incompatibility or neglect. This uneven legal landscape created what historians call migratory divorce, where individuals or couples traveled, sometimes across the country, to dissolve their marriages under more favorable laws. No place became more famous for this practice than Reno, Nevada. By the 1920s and 1930s, Reno was not only known for its gambling and frontier atmosphere, but also for its surprisingly short residency requirement to file for divorce. While most states demanded at least a year, Nevada required only 6 months, and later reduced this to a mere 6 weeks. This policy transformed Reno into a strange kind of pilgrimage site, not for religious devotion, but for marital dissolution. Arriving in Reno was a ritual in itself. Individuals seeking divorce, often women from wealthier backgrounds, would rent rooms in boarding houses or stay on divorce ranches scattered across the outskirts of the city. These ranches, operated like a mix between hotels and working farms, provided lodging, meals, and companionship for guests who needed to bide their time before meeting the 6-week residency rule. In exchange, residents often participated in ranch chores, feeding animals, cooking meals, or tending gardens. The experience was both mundane and quietly transformative. For many women, the time spent at a divorce ranch was their first real taste of independence, away from the watchful eyes of husbands, families, and social circles back home. Newspapers of the era picked up on this cultural phenomenon, dubbing Reno the divorce capital of America. Articles described elegant women from New York, Chicago, and Boston arriving in Nevada, often traveling with trunks full of fine clothing but leaving behind troubled marriages. Reporters highlighted the curious contrast between the glamour of wealthy divorce seekers and the dusty, frontier character of Reno itself. For readers across the nation, it was both scandalous and fascinating, an intersection of high society's private struggles with the rustic backdrop of the American West. The legal process itself was not especially complex once the residency requirement was fulfilled. Petitioners filed their claims in local courts, typically citing extreme cruelty, neglect, or failure to provide. Judges in Reno became accustomed to these cases, processing them with efficiency. Some hearings lasted only a few minutes, ending with a decree that freed the petitioner to remarry if they wished. The quickness of the procedure only added to Reno's mystique. A journey of weeks could undo a marriage that once seemed indissoluble. The impact of Reno divorces spread far beyond Nevada's borders. Critics argued that the system undermined the seriousness of marriage nationwide. If someone could simply spend 6 weeks in Reno and return home with a divorce decree, did that not render stricter state laws meaningless? Reformers called for national uniformity in divorce statutes, but the United States, with its strong tradition of state sovereignty, resisted such centralization. As a result, Reno thrived as a unique destination, profiting not only from the divorces themselves but also from the broader tourism and service economy that grew around them. Restaurants, shops, and entertainment venues catered to the steady stream of divorce seekers who temporarily called the city home. For women especially, Reno symbolized more than just legal convenience. In many cases, divorce represented the only path to autonomy. Married women, particularly those of means, had often been socially trapped by the fear of scandal. The anonymity of Reno, combined with the legitimacy of its courts, provided a way to end unhappy unions without permanently destroying reputations in their home communities. Letters and memoirs from women who stayed at divorce ranches reveal a mix of relief, loneliness, and hope for a new life. Some even described their time in Reno as unexpectedly peaceful, a pause in their lives that allowed reflection before re-entering society as single individuals. The Reno divorce phenomenon also highlighted tensions between tradition and modernity. On one side, conservative critics denounced it as a moral disaster, an insult to sacred vows. On the other, reformers and progressives pointed to it as a sign of changing times, where personal happiness and well-being were valued over rigid adherence to duty. The public conversation mirrored larger cultural shifts, women gaining the right to vote in 1920, the Jazz Age challenging social norms, and the Great Depression reshaping families. Divorce, once whispered about in hushed tones, had become a topic of open debate. Yet Reno's prominence was not to last forever. By the mid-20th century, as divorce laws across the country gradually relaxed, fewer people needed to make the journey to Nevada. States began shortening residency requirements, broadening grounds for divorce, and reducing the social stigma surrounding the process. Reno, once at the center of national attention, quietly settled back into its role as just another Western city, though its legacy as the divorce capital lingered in cultural memory. The story of Reno raises deeper questions about the American approach to marriage and law. Was the freedom to seek divorce in a distant state an abuse of the system, or a necessary safety valve in a society that otherwise restricted personal choice? Did Reno's role help normalize divorce by making it more visible, or did it simply highlight the uneven patchwork of laws that governed family life? Whatever the answers, Reno stands as a vivid chapter in the history of divorce, one that reveals not only the mechanics of law but also the lived experiences of those who sought freedom, and the quiet, often lonely weeks they spent waiting on the high desert plains. And as the nation moved forward, the question remained, if Reno could make divorce simple, why could the rest of the country not agree on a common standard? By the middle of the 20th century, Reno's fame as a divorce capital was fading, not because fewer people wanted to dissolve their marriages, but because the rest of the United States was catching up. What had once been a special feature of Nevada's legal code began to spread across the nation, reshaping how Americans thought about divorce. The unevenness of state divorce laws had long been a thorn in the side of reformers. As far back as the 19th century, legal scholars, judges, and social commentators complained that a country united under one constitution had 50 different definitions of marital law. A marriage valid in New York could be undone in Indiana or Nevada, creating endless complications. Was a Reno divorce valid everywhere? Could an individual remarry back home without fear of being charged with bigamy? These questions were not just theoretical. Court cases arose where ex-spouses contested settlements, or where children's legitimacy was questioned because one state refused to recognize another's divorce decree. The Supreme Court itself was forced to intervene in a series of cases in the 1940s, particularly the famous Williams v. North Carolina decisions. At stake was whether divorces obtained in Nevada, with its famously short residency requirement, had to be recognized by stricter states like North Carolina. The court's rulings were complex and did not fully settle the matter, but they highlighted the absurdity of a system where someone might be divorced in one state and still considered married in another. The very fabric of family law seemed to unravel under the strain of legal inconsistency. In response, various organizations pushed for reform. The American Bar Association promoted the idea of uniform divorce laws, hoping to reduce the chaos. Religious groups also campaigned for stricter national standards, fearing that permissive states undermined the sanctity of marriage. Yet the federal government, wary of encroaching on state authority, resisted national legislation. Family law remained largely a state issue, reflecting the enduring tension between local autonomy and national coherence in American governance. While lawyers and legislators debated, society itself was shifting. The mid-20th century brought new attitudes toward marriage, gender roles, and personal freedom. World War II had disrupted countless families, with separations, infidelities, and hurried wartime marriages leaving a trail of broken unions in the post-war years. Women who had entered the workforce during the war were reluctant to return fully to dependence, and many viewed divorce as a path to independence if their marriages faltered. At the same time, the cultural stigma around divorce began to soften. Hollywood films occasionally featured divorced characters without portraying them as outcasts. Magazines published advice columns on navigating divorce, framing it less as a moral failure and more as a practical challenge. In middle-class neighborhoods, divorced individuals were still gossiped about, but they were no longer shunned to the degree they had been a generation earlier. Slowly but steadily, divorce became less shocking and more ordinary. This cultural shift diminished the need for migratory divorce. If one's own state allowed divorce on more reasonable grounds and within shorter time frames, why travel all the way to Reno? By the 1960s, many states had reformed their laws, recognizing causes such as irreconcilable differences. Residency requirements shortened, and courts became more streamlined. The unique draw of Nevada faded, leaving behind only a nostalgic memory of divorce ranches and 6-week stays on dusty plains. Yet the drive toward uniformity was never fully realized. Even today, marriage and divorce laws vary across the United States, though the differences are less dramatic than in Reno's heyday. What truly ended the migratory divorce era was not a federal law, but the gradual normalization of divorce everywhere. As divorce grew more common, states found little reason to maintain overly rigid restrictions that only pushed residents to seek solutions elsewhere. It is important to note that behind all the legal debates and cultural trends were. When Americans look back at the 20th century, the years surrounding World War II often stand out as a period of extraordinary upheaval. The war transformed the economy, the military, and the very structure of society. Yet one of its quieter consequences was the way it reshaped marriage and divorce. What had once been seen as a shameful rarity began to emerge as a visible, if still painful, feature of American life. Before the war, divorce rates were climbing slowly but steadily. The Roaring Twenties had introduced looser social attitudes, urban living, and women's greater independence. The Great Depression then strained marriages further, as unemployment, financial stress, and forced migration wore down family stability. But World War II created a set of pressures that dwarfed what had come before. The first was the sheer number of rapid wartime marriages. With millions of men drafted and uncertainty hanging over the future, countless couples married quickly, sometimes after knowing each other for only weeks. Soldiers heading overseas wanted the security of a spouse at home, and women often married in hopes of stability, love, or simply a chance at a new life during uncertain times. These unions were often heartfelt, but they were also rushed, and when the war ended, many couples discovered they had little in common outside of the intensity of wartime romance. The second pressure was separation. Soldiers stationed abroad for years were forced into long-distance marriages, reliant on letters that often arrived weeks late. Miscommunication, loneliness, and temptation eroded many unions. Infidelity was not uncommon, on both sides. Wives sometimes entered relationships while their husbands were away, and soldiers abroad occasionally did the same. Upon returning home, couples faced the difficult task of reconciling these wounds. The third factor was the changing role of women. For the first time in American history, large numbers of women entered the workforce, filling positions in factories, offices, and shipyards. Rosie the Riveter became a national symbol of female empowerment. Women discovered that they could earn wages, manage households, and participate in the economy in ways that had previously been denied to them. After the war, many were reluctant to surrender this independence. For some, returning to traditional domestic roles felt like a step backward. When combined with marriages strained by distance and hastily made vows, the result was a surge in divorces. Indeed, statistics tell the story clearly. Divorce rates, which had been rising gradually since the late 19th century, spiked dramatically after World War II. In 1946 alone, the number of divorces nearly doubled compared to pre-war figures. Newspapers reported on the phenomenon with alarm, calling it a divorce epidemic. Some commentators framed it as a moral crisis, blaming loose wartime morals or selfishness. Others recognized it as the inevitable consequence of unprecedented social strain. For the individuals involved, however, the experience was often quietly devastating. Court records from the era describe petitions citing desertion, cruelty, neglect, or simple incompatibility. Some divorces were acrimonious, others surprisingly cooperative. Children were frequently caught in the middle, their custody contested in ways that reflected shifting attitudes toward parenting. Judges increasingly awarded young children to mothers, reinforcing the tender years doctrine that had gained ground in the late 19th century. Culturally, the divorce boom of the post-war years was deeply unsettling. Marriage had long been considered a cornerstone of American life, tied to ideals of stability, morality, and the American dream. Divorce challenged this vision, forcing people to confront the reality that many marriages were fragile, temporary, or built on shaky foundations. Advice columns in newspapers urged couples to work harder at reconciliation. Clergy preached about the dangers of easy separation. Yet the numbers spoke for themselves. Tens of thousands of Americans were choosing divorce despite the stigma. One overlooked aspect of the post-war divorce boom was how ordinary it was. While Reno still processed its share of quick divorces, most took place quietly in local courthouses across the nation. These were not the glamorous socialite cases of earlier decades, but the lives of middle-class families in Detroit, Cleveland, or Los Angeles. Divorce, once a sensational scandal, was becoming a mundane legal proceeding. At the same time, popular culture began to reflect these changes. Novels and films tentatively included divorced characters, sometimes sympathetically, sometimes as cautionary tales. By the late 1940s, a divorced woman might appear in a Hollywood drama as a tragic figure, struggling to find her place in society. Men, too, were portrayed as adrift after failed marriages. These cultural representations reinforced the sense that divorce was both troubling and increasingly unavoidable. As the Cold War began, divorce even intersected with politics. American leaders contrasted their society with the Soviet Union, where the state claimed authority over family life. In the United States, by contrast, marriage and divorce were framed as matters of personal choice, albeit ones with social consequences. This tension highlighted a deeper truth, that the rising divorce rate was both a reflection of individual freedom and a challenge to social cohesion. The 1940s and 1950s thus marked a turning point. Divorce was no longer a rare scandal confined to bold individuals willing to defy convention. It was becoming part of the landscape of American family life, a fact that could no longer be denied. Yet it still carried heavy stigma, and those who divorced often faced judgment, gossip, and social exclusion, and so the question lingered, if divorce had become so common in the aftermath of war, what would happen in times of peace, prosperity, and stability? Would the trend reverse, with Americans returning to traditional ideals of lifelong marriage? Or had the war merely accelerated a cultural shift that would continue, reshaping family life for generations to come? The years following World War II are often remembered as a golden age of American family life. Suburban neighborhoods spread rapidly, filled with tidy homes, trimmed lawns, and the iconic image of the nuclear family, a breadwinning father, a homemaking mother, and children raised in relative comfort. From television sitcoms to glossy magazine ads, the ideal of lifelong marriage seemed stronger than ever. Yet beneath the carefully manicured surface of suburban prosperity, tensions simmered. These tensions would eventually fuel the next major transformation in the history of divorce. In the 1950s, American culture emphasized stability and conformity. Marriage was not simply a private relationship, it was a symbol of civic duty, moral integrity, and even patriotic virtue. A strong marriage was thought to protect the nation from the threats of communism, delinquency, and social decay. Divorce, therefore, carried a heavy stigma. In suburban neighborhoods, a divorced couple stood out like a broken fence on an otherwise perfect street. But statistics tell a more complex story. While the divorce rate declined slightly from its wartime peak, it did not return to pre-war levels. Instead, it settled at a higher plateau. Quietly, steadily, thousands of Americans continued to end their marriages each year. These divorces often went unnoticed by the broader culture, overshadowed by the dominant narrative of stable, middle-class families. Yet they revealed cracks in the suburban dream. One of the central tensions lay in gender roles. After World War II, many women were expected to leave the workforce and return to domestic life. The booming economy allowed families to live on a single income, reinforcing the idea that a woman's place was in the home. Popular advice books and television programs celebrated the ideal housewife who cooked, cleaned, and cared for her children while remaining cheerful and supportive of her husband. For many women, however, this role was deeply unfulfilling. Having experienced independence during the war years, they now found themselves confined to kitchens and suburban living rooms. Betty Friedan would famously describe this dissatisfaction in her 1963 book The Feminine Mystique, calling it, "the problem that has no name." While not every woman shared this sense of restlessness, enough did that it became a cultural undercurrent, quietly challenging the stability of marriage. At the same time, the broader society was changing. The 1950s and 1960s saw the rise of the civil rights movement, student activism, and growing challenges to authority. In this atmosphere of questioning, the institution of marriage was not immune. Younger generations began to see marriage less as a duty and more as a choice, something that should bring personal fulfillment rather than simply uphold tradition. The legal system, however, lagged behind these cultural shifts. Divorce in most states still required proof of fault, adultery, cruelty, abandonment, or similar grounds. This created a peculiar and often humiliating dynamic. Couples who mutually wished to separate sometimes had to manufacture evidence of misconduct in order to satisfy the law. Private investigators were hired to catch a spouse in staged affairs, photographs were produced of hotel room meetings, and courtroom testimonies included exaggerated tales of cruelty or neglect. Judges, lawyers, and the public all knew that many of these cases were contrived, yet the system required them. This charade revealed a profound tension between law and lived reality. On paper, marriage was supposed to be permanent unless one party had clearly broken its vows. In practice, many couples simply no longer wanted to remain together, but the law forced them into dishonesty to achieve their goal. The system not only strained couples but also eroded respect for the law itself. If ordinary people saw divorce as a game of staged evidence, how meaningful could the institution remain? By the late 1950s, reformers were increasingly calling for change. Some argued for more honest legal standards that would allow couples to separate without assigning blame. Others worried that such reforms would encourage frivolous divorces, undermining the stability of families and harming children. The debate echoed earlier controversies from Reno's heyday but took on new urgency as divorce became less stigmatized and more common. Cultural shifts further accelerated the pressure. The women's rights movement gained momentum in the 1960s, demanding equality not only in the workplace but also in marriage. Feminists argued that traditional marriage often trapped women in dependent roles, leaving them vulnerable to neglect or abuse. Access to education and jobs gave women more options, and some chose divorce as a path to autonomy. For men, too, the shifting cultural landscape brought challenges. Expectations of lifelong breadwinning, coupled with the stress of suburban conformity, weighed heavily. Some turned to divorce as an escape from pressures they felt unable to meet. The sexual revolution of the 1960s added another layer of complexity. With changing attitudes toward premarital sex, contraception, and personal freedom, marriage no longer held the same monopoly over intimacy. For some, this new openness made divorce less daunting. If remarriage or relationships outside traditional marriage were less stigmatized, why remain trapped in an unhappy union? The media reflected these changes. Television shows began cautiously addressing divorce, though often indirectly. Films depicted married life with more nuance, sometimes acknowledging infidelity, dissatisfaction, or separation. Popular magazines published stories of divorced individuals rebuilding their lives, portraying them not as failures but as people navigating new realities. By the mid-1960s, the pressure for legal reform reached a breaking point. Judges and lawyers recognized the absurdity of the fault-based system. Legislators, responding to cultural shifts, began exploring alternatives. Scholars proposed the concept of no-fault divorce, in which a couple could dissolve their marriage simply by declaring that it was irretrievably broken, without the need for accusations or staged evidence. California would be the first state to adopt such a law in 1969, setting off a nationwide transformation. But in the years just before this reform, divorce remained caught in a paradox. It was both more common and more stigmatized, more openly discussed yet still fraught with secrecy and shame. Suburban neighborhoods hid their fractures behind white picket fences, while courts staged elaborate dramas of fault. Beneath the polished surface of post-war prosperity, the reality was that marriage was changing, quietly but irreversibly. And so, as America stood on the brink of the cultural revolutions of the late 1960s, one question loomed: if the suburban dream could not contain the realities of human dissatisfaction, what new vision of marriage, and divorce, would take its place? Individuals rebuilding their lives, portraying them not as failures but as people navigating new realities. By the mid-1960s, the pressure for legal reform reached a breaking point. Judges and lawyers recognized the absurdity of the fault-based system. Legislators, responding to cultural shifts, began exploring alternatives. Scholars proposed the concept of no-fault divorce, in which a couple could dissolve their marriage simply by declaring that it was irretrievably broken, without the need for accusations or staged evidence. California would be the first state to adopt such a law in 1969, setting off a nationwide transformation. But in the years just before this reform, divorce remained caught in a paradox. It was both more common and more stigmatized, more openly discussed yet still fraught with secrecy and shame. Suburban neighborhoods hid their fractures behind white picket fences, while courts staged elaborate dramas of fault. Beneath the polished surface of post-war prosperity, the reality was that marriage was changing, quietly but irreversibly. And so, as America stood on the brink of the cultural revolutions of the late 1960s, one question loomed: if the suburban dream could not contain the realities of human dissatisfaction, what new vision of marriage, and divorce, would take its place? By the late 1960s, the United States stood at a crossroads. The suburban ideal, once celebrated as the pinnacle of family life, had already begun to show its fractures. The women's rights movement was reshaping gender expectations, the sexual revolution was challenging traditional notions of intimacy, and young Americans were increasingly skeptical of institutions that demanded blind loyalty. Against this backdrop, divorce reform emerged not just as a legal question but as a cultural necessity. The old system of fault-based divorce had grown unsustainable. Courts across the nation were bogged down with fabricated cases of adultery, cruelty, or abandonment. Judges, weary of presiding over obvious fictions, sometimes joked privately that their courtrooms had become theaters. Lawyers openly acknowledged that their role was not to uncover truth but to construct a plausible narrative that would satisfy the law's outdated requirements. The dishonesty of the process undermined both respect for the law and the dignity of the people involved. California led the way toward change. In 1969, Governor Ronald Reagan, himself a divorced man, signed the nation's first no-fault divorce law. The statute allowed couples to end their marriage simply by declaring irreconcilable differences. For the first time in American legal history, a marriage could be dissolved without one spouse being declared guilty of wrongdoing. The significance of this reform cannot be overstated. It represented a philosophical shift in how marriage was understood. No longer was marriage treated primarily as a binding contract enforced by the state; instead, it became a voluntary partnership that could be ended when it no longer served the needs of the individuals involved. This shift placed personal fulfillment at the center of the marital ideal. Other states quickly followed California's lead. By the mid-1970s, most states had adopted some form of no-fault divorce, either supplementing or replacing fault-based laws. The pace of reform reflected both public demand and pragmatic necessity. Legislators recognized that ordinary people were already finding ways around the old system. Reform simply brought the law into alignment with social reality. The impact on divorce rates was immediate and striking. Throughout the 1970s, the number of divorces in the United States climbed sharply. By the end of the decade, roughly 1 in 2 marriages was expected to end in divorce. Newspapers and television programs began speaking of a divorce epidemic, reflecting both concern and fascination. For some, the new laws represented liberation. Individuals trapped in unhappy or abusive marriages could finally leave without enduring the humiliation of staged accusations. For others, however, the rising numbers seemed to signal a collapse of moral order. The debate over no-fault divorce extended beyond law into culture and politics. Conservatives argued that easier divorce threatened the stability of families and harmed children. They warned of a generation growing up in broken homes, deprived of the security that traditional marriage was supposed to provide. Religious leaders, too, expressed alarm, insisting that marriage was sacred and should not be dissolved simply because of irreconcilable differences. Supporters of the reform countered with equally passionate arguments. They emphasized that forcing couples to remain in toxic or loveless marriages served no one, not the spouses, not the children, and not society. They pointed to evidence that children often fared better in stable single-parent homes than in households marked by conflict and resentment. For feminists, no-fault divorce represented a critical victory, giving women the ability to leave marriages without the nearly impossible burden of proving fault. The cultural consequences of no-fault divorce extended far beyond the legal sphere. Marriage itself began to be reimagined. No longer seen as a permanent duty, it became increasingly viewed as a partnership contingent on mutual satisfaction. This shift carried profound implications for how people approached relationships. Couples entered marriage with a greater awareness that it might not last forever, and with an understanding that personal happiness was a legitimate reason to end it. This transformation reshaped American life in countless ways. The wedding industry expanded, fueled in part by the fact that more people were marrying multiple times. Single-parent households became more visible, challenging schools, workplaces, and policymakers to adapt. Popular culture reflected the changes. Films like Kramer vs. Kramer, 1979, depicted the complexities of divorce with sensitivity, highlighting both the struggles and the humanity of those involved. Economically, the rise in divorce had wide-ranging effects. Women who divorced often faced financial hardship, especially if they had been homemakers without independent incomes. Debates about alimony, child support, and property division grew more urgent, leading to further legal reforms in family law. Over time, these reforms aimed to balance fairness with practicality, though inequalities persisted. By the 1980s, the divorce revolution had fully transformed the American family landscape. Divorce was no longer rare or hidden, it was a common life event, experienced by millions. Sociologists studied its causes and consequences, while politicians debated how to respond. Some states experimented with covenant marriages, offering couples the option of entering into more binding unions that limited grounds for divorce. Yet these experiments remained rare, reflecting the broader acceptance of flexibility and choice in marriage. The generational impact was profound. Children who grew up during the divorce boom carried different expectations into their own adult lives. Some became wary of marriage, choosing to cohabit instead. Others embraced marriage but entered it with a recognition that it was not necessarily permanent. Surveys revealed a growing emphasis on companionship and personal fulfillment as the primary goals of marriage, rather than duty or tradition. The no-fault revolution also had ripple effects beyond marriage itself. It reflected, and reinforced, a broader cultural emphasis on individual autonomy. Just as people asserted the right to control their careers, their bodies, and their identities, they asserted the right to control the course of their intimate relationships. In this sense, divorce reform was part of a larger story of 20th-century liberalization and the expansion of personal freedom. And yet, even as no-fault divorce became the norm, questions lingered. Did easier divorce weaken the fabric of society, or did it simply acknowledge the reality of human relationships? Were children better served by stability at all costs, or by the honesty of adults who admitted when a marriage could not be saved? Did the emphasis on personal fulfillment strengthen or erode the meaning of commitment? These questions, unresolved in the 1970s and 1980s, continue to echo in debates today. Divorce reshaped not only laws and families but also the very way Americans think about love, obligation, and happiness. So, as the United States emerged from the divorce revolution of the 20th century, one could not help but wonder, had marriage lost its permanence, or had it simply been redefined to reflect a more honest vision of human life? By the early 1990s, divorce in the United States had transformed from a once scandalous rupture into an accepted, if still emotionally painful, aspect of ordinary life. Where once whispers of marital failure might have circulated around a small town or church congregation, by the close of the 20th century, divorce was so common that nearly every family knew it firsthand. What had been a shocking exception had become, in many ways, an expected possibility. The seeds of this normalization were planted decades earlier. The introduction of no-fault divorce in the 1970s had revolutionized marriage, shifting it from a legal contract bound by duty to a more flexible partnership based on personal fulfillment. By the 1980s, the rapid rise in divorce had alarmed politicians, religious leaders, and cultural commentators. Headlines warned of a divorce epidemic, and some feared the family as an institution was on the verge of collapse. But something changed in the 1990s. The rate of divorce, which had climbed sharply for decades, began to level off. It did not disappear, nor did it return to the low levels of the early 20th century, but it stabilized. For many Americans, divorce was no longer a symbol of societal breakdown, it was simply part of life. Couples entered marriage with the awareness that it might not last forever, and children grew up in blended families with step-siblings and step-parents as a common reality. One reason for this shift was cultural representation. Television, film, and literature of the 1990s and early 2000s portrayed divorce with nuance rather than scandal. Sitcoms like Friends and Frasier featured divorced characters as ordinary people, not social pariahs. Movies such as Mrs. Doubtfire, 1993, depicted divorced parents navigating co-parenting with humor and humanity. Even family-friendly programming acknowledged the reality of divorce, reflecting its prevalence in viewers' own lives. Schools, too, adapted. By the late 20th century, many schools offered counseling programs for children of divorced parents, helping them process emotional challenges. Educational materials acknowledged the variety of family structures, moving beyond the assumption of a two-parent household. These institutional changes signaled that divorce was no longer an anomaly to be hidden, but a circumstance that required practical support. Economics also played a role in normalization. By the 1990s, more women were firmly established in the workforce, with careers and incomes of their own. This independence reduced the stigma of divorce, as women could realistically support themselves and their children outside of marriage. Meanwhile, men, too, increasingly participated in shared custody arrangements, reflecting shifting attitudes toward fatherhood. The stereotype of divorced fathers as distant or absent began to give way to models of active co-parenting, though challenges remained. Still, the emotional reality of divorce did not disappear with its normalization. Couples continued to experience grief, conflict, and uncertainty when marriages ended. Children often struggled with divided households, adjusting to new routines and blended families. What changed was not the pain itself, but the way society responded to it. Divorce was no longer treated as a mark of personal failure. Instead, it was understood as one of many possible outcomes in the complex landscape of human relationships. Religious communities wrestled with these changes. Some faith traditions softened their stance, offering support for divorced members rather than exclusion. Others held firmly to teachings that emphasized marriage as permanent, creating tension between doctrine and lived experience. In many churches, divorce became a quiet reality. The pews were filled with single parents, remarried couples, and blended families, even as sermons continued to extol the virtues of lifelong union. Legal reforms continued as well. Child custody laws shifted toward the principle of the best interests of the child, with many states increasingly favoring joint custody arrangements. Courts recognized that children benefited from maintaining strong relationships with both parents, when possible. Debates over alimony reflected changing gender dynamics. With more women working, long-term financial support for ex-wives became less automatic, though still significant in cases where one partner had sacrificed career opportunities for the marriage. The normalization of divorce also reshaped the way people thought about marriage itself. Surveys from the late 20th century revealed that Americans continued to value marriage highly, but they no longer saw it as an unbreakable bond. Instead, marriage was increasingly viewed as a relationship that should endure only as long as it was healthy and fulfilling. This pragmatic approach stood in stark contrast to the older ideal of lifelong permanence, but it reflected the realities of a society where divorce was commonplace. Interestingly, as divorce became normalized, the stigma began to shift. Instead of judging divorced individuals harshly, some observers began questioning those who stayed in unhappy marriages. Why remain trapped in bitterness when freedom was possible? In this sense, the cultural narrative flipped. Divorce was no longer the shameful choice, but sometimes the brave or rational one. Yet, this normalization raised new questions. If divorce was so common, what did marriage mean? Was it still a solemn commitment, or had it become a provisional arrangement, lasting only until one or both partners decided otherwise? Did the emphasis on personal fulfillment strengthen relationships by making them more intentional, or weaken them by encouraging exit at the first sign of difficulty? By the close of the 20th century, America had not resolved these questions. But one reality was clear: divorce had become an ordinary part of the social fabric. The panic of the 1970s and 1980s had given way to adaptation, and the nation had adjusted to a world where nearly half of marriages ended before death. And so, as the calendar turned to the 21st century, a new chapter began. Divorce was no longer scandalous, but it was not static either. New patterns emerged: couples divorcing later in life, debates about how divorce affected children into adulthood, and the rise of cohabitation as an alternative to marriage altogether. These trends suggested that the story of divorce in America was still unfolding, raising the question, in the new millennium, what role would divorce play in the ever-changing landscape of family life? By the early 2000s, America had grown accustomed to divorce as a normal part of life. Yet, even as the overall divorce rate stabilized, new patterns began to emerge, patterns that revealed how changing demographics, cultural values, and technology continued to reshape the institution of marriage and its dissolution. Perhaps the most surprising trend was the rise of what scholars began to call gray divorce. This term referred to divorces among older couples, often those over the age of 50, who had been married for decades. In earlier generations, long marriages were assumed to last until death. But by the early 21st century, a growing number of older adults were choosing to separate, sometimes after 30 or 40 years together. Why this shift? Several factors converged. Life expectancy had increased, meaning that a 55-year-old might expect to live another 30 years or more. If a marriage was unsatisfying, the prospect of enduring decades of unhappiness felt less acceptable. Economic independence also played a role. More women entering retirement age had careers, pensions, and savings of their own, giving them the means to leave a marriage if they wished. Cultural attitudes had changed as well. The stigma once attached to divorce was far less intense. Even for older adults, the stories behind gray divorce were varied. Some couples simply drifted apart after raising children, realizing that they no longer shared much beyond parenthood. Others had long-standing conflicts that became harder to ignore once the distractions of work and child-rearing faded. Some individuals sought new beginnings, hoping to pursue travel, hobbies, or relationships in later life without the constraints of an unhappy marriage. For better or worse, these divorces reflected the new reality that marriage was no longer a lifelong guarantee, regardless of age. Meanwhile, younger generations were shaping the landscape in different ways. Millennials, who came of age in the 2000s and 2010s, witnessed the high divorce rates of their parents' generation. Many became cautious about marriage, delaying it until later in life or choosing to cohabit instead. Statistically, millennials married at lower rates than baby boomers had at the same age, but those who did marry were more selective and tended to have lower divorce rates. In this sense, the legacy of divorce reshaped marriage itself. Fewer people rushed into it, and those who did often approached it with deliberate care. Technology, too, played an increasingly important role. The rise of the internet and social media transformed how people met, connected, and, sometimes, separated. Online dating became mainstream by the 2000s, offering divorced individuals new opportunities to find partners. Social media, however, introduced new complications. Platforms like Facebook created spaces where old flames could reconnect, sometimes straining existing marriages. Text messages and digital communication provided both intimacy and evidence, with lawyers increasingly presenting phone records or social media posts in divorce proceedings. Technology also influenced the logistics of divorce itself. Online resources offered guides, mediation services, and even do-it-yourself divorce kits, making the process more accessible. Virtual communication allowed divorced parents to coordinate custody schedules more efficiently. At the same time, the visibility of personal lives on social media could heighten conflicts, as arguments spilled from private spaces into digital ones. Culturally, the meaning of divorce continued to shift. By the 2000s, divorce was rarely portrayed as scandalous in film or television. Instead, it was often depicted as a transformative life event, sometimes painful but also an opportunity for growth. Shows like Sex and the City presented divorced women as independent and adventurous, while dramas explored the complexities of co-parenting and blended families. Divorce was no longer the end of a social identity, it was a stage in the ongoing narrative of adult life. Economically, divorce remained challenging, particularly in an era of rising inequality. Gray divorce often carried significant financial consequences, as retirement savings had to be divided and older individuals faced the prospect of living on reduced incomes. For younger couples, student debt, housing costs, and childcare expenses added strain. Legal reform sought to balance these challenges, but the financial realities of divorce remained uneven. Another shift emerged in how divorce was discussed. Increasingly, experts emphasized the importance of cooperative approaches, such as mediation and collaborative divorce, which sought to minimize conflict and prioritize the well-being of children. These methods reflected a broader cultural move away from adversarial models and toward problem-solving frameworks. For some, this made divorce less traumatic and more manageable. Generational attitudes toward marriage and divorce continued to evolve. Surveys from the 2010s showed that Americans still valued marriage highly but were less likely to see it as essential to adulthood. Cohabitation, once stigmatized, had become widespread, and many couples lived together for years without marrying at all. For these couples, separation often carried fewer legal complexities but raised similar emotional challenges. The rise of same-sex marriage added another dimension to the story. After decades of legal battles, the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage nationwide in 2015. With this recognition came the reality of same-sex divorce, which posed unique legal questions but also underscored the universality of relationship challenges. Divorce, in this sense, became a shared experience across a broader spectrum of American society. Yet even as divorce became normalized and diversified, questions persisted. Did the rise of gray divorce reflect a crisis of long-term commitment, or simply a new form of honesty about relationships that no longer worked? Did millennials' caution about marriage strengthen the institution by making it more deliberate, or weaken it by reducing its cultural centrality? And how would technology, ever more integrated into daily life, reshape the ways people formed and dissolved their bonds in the years to come? By the close of the 2010s, one truth was clear: divorce was no longer a temporary spike or passing trend. It had become an enduring feature of American life, adapting with each generation and reflecting the broader cultural, economic, and technological changes of society itself. And yet, as the 21st century moved forward, another question loomed. What would divorce look like in the decades to come, when marriage itself was already being redefined in new and unexpected ways? By the 2020s, divorce in America had become less a dramatic rupture and more a normalized chapter in the life cycle of many adults. The once sensational headlines about broken families and divorce epidemics had largely faded. Instead, divorce was treated as a social reality, common, expected in some cases, and yet still deeply personal. What had shifted most was not the emotional pain of ending a marriage, but the way society understood, accommodated, and even anticipated it. Statistically, the overall divorce rate in the United States has declined since its peak in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Fewer people are divorcing today than in past decades, but this trend reflects a broader transformation in how Americans approach marriage. The decline is largely tied to falling marriage rates. Fewer people are marrying at all, and those who do often delay marriage until their late 20s or 30s. Marriages entered into later in life tend to be more stable, contributing to lower divorce rates. Yet beneath this broad decline, new patterns have emerged. Gray divorce, first identified in the early 2000s, has continued to grow. Couples over 50 now make up a significant share of divorces, reflecting both longer lifespans and shifting cultural norms. For many older adults, retirement becomes a moment of reckoning. With children grown and careers winding down, some couples discover that their lives have drifted apart. Divorce at this stage is often less about conflict and more about personal fulfillment, a desire to spend later years in different ways. Technology continues to reshape the dynamics of both marriage and divorce. Social media can exacerbate tensions, with online interactions sometimes sparking jealousy or suspicion. At the same time, digital tools help families manage the realities of separation. Co-parenting apps allow divorced parents to coordinate schedules, share information, and reduce misunderstandings. Virtual mediation services make divorce more accessible, particularly during times when in-person meetings are difficult, such as during the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic itself had a curious impact on marriage and divorce. In its early months, some commentators predicted a surge in divorces, as couples faced unprecedented stress from job losses, health fears, and constant proximity. For some marriages, the strain proved too great, and divorce did follow. But for others, the crisis reinforced bonds, encouraging couples to reevaluate priorities and lean on one another. The long-term effects remain difficult to measure, but the pandemic underscored how external pressures continue to shape intimate lives. Generational differences remain striking. Millennials, who grew up during the divorce boom of the 1980s and 1990s, are less likely to marry impulsively. Many delay marriage until they feel financially stable and emotionally prepared. As a result, their divorce rates are lower than those of earlier generations at the same age. Gen Z, now entering adulthood, appears to be following similar patterns, cautious, pragmatic, and less bound by the assumption that marriage is the only path to a fulfilling life. Cohabitation has become an accepted alternative. More couples live together without marrying, raising children, and sharing finances outside of legal marriage. When these relationships end, they may not appear in divorce statistics, but the emotional and social dynamics often mirror those of formal divorce. This shift raises questions about the future of marriage itself. If fewer people marry, what role will divorce play in society? Will it remain central, or gradually fade as marriage becomes less common? Economically, divorce remains uneven. For some, particularly those with substantial assets or complex custody arrangements, it is a costly and stressful process. For others, simplified procedures and online resources make it more manageable. Still, the financial impact often falls hardest on women, especially older women in gray divorces who face retirement with divided resources. Policymakers continue to grapple with how to support individuals navigating these transitions, particularly as the population ages. Culturally, the stigma surrounding divorce has nearly disappeared. Children of divorced parents are no longer seen as exceptions, blended families are part of the mainstream. Popular culture reflects this normalization, portraying divorced characters as complex individuals rather than stereotypes. From television dramas to reality shows, divorce is treated as one thread in the broader fabric of modern life. At the same time, a subtle cultural question lingers: if divorce is so common, what does marriage mean today? For many, marriage remains a powerful symbol of love and commitment, but one entered with the awareness that it may not last forever. For others, the institution itself feels less relevant, a relic of an earlier era. Sociologists suggest that marriage has become increasingly optional, a choice reserved for those who see it as personally meaningful rather than socially mandatory. Looking to the future, several possibilities emerge. Will divorce rates continue to decline as marriage becomes more selective? Will gray divorce reshape how society supports older adults, particularly women, in retirement? How will technology, with its ever-expanding influence on communication and intimacy, alter the course of relationships? Perhaps the most important shift is that divorce has become less of a public scandal and more of a private journey. Where once the law, the church, and the community scrutinized every decision, today divorce is largely regarded as a personal choice. This shift reflects the broader trajectory of American society, from conformity to individual autonomy, from rigid structures to flexible arrangements. And yet, even in this era of acceptance, the emotional realities remain constant. Divorce continues to be painful, complex, and transformative. It reshapes families, challenges identities, and forces individuals to reconsider their futures. Its normalization does not diminish its significance, rather, it underscores the enduring truth that human relationships are fragile, evolving, and deeply tied to the cultural moment in which they exist. So, as the story of divorce in America enters its newest chapter, one question persists: is the rise and normalization of divorce a sign of societal decline, or simply evidence that our understanding of love, commitment, and personal freedom has evolved with the times?